Hi, my name is Stephanie Arell. I think before I've let you guys know that my actual PhD work was in theological studies, but I have a background also in psychology, actually literature and philosophy. I have a master's degree in comparative literature and then a master's degree in religion and psychiatry. I'm interested in the way in which these disciplines intersect. Always behind my interest lies the question about how do we continue to make meaning as humans with these disciplines? Or how do we answer the big questions related to trauma, as you've probably learned if you've watched the station, but then also related to just experiences of human suffering that we all endure. I've been thinking lately about people that have experiences with the church or with their church or with religion that are less than positive, and let's say even really harmful or really shaming, or create situations where they feel so excluded by a community that they trusted or by an authority that they trusted, and even injured by that community or authority, that they reject the church, that they turn inward, that they internalize their own sense of shame or diminished self-worth. And I feel both saddened by that and disturbed in relationship to what people who interpret religious messages do that hurt other people, and sad because I think there's real resources within religion that can help us answer and deal with big human questions and forms of suffering. I was raised Catholic, and I have luckily really had no bad experiences with the Catholic Church. Recently, somebody interviewed me for another YouTube station, and I'm not sure it was ever publicized. It didn't go so great, and I think because the question was about having experienced shame as a result of your religion. And really, honestly, I have nothing but positive experiences and impressions of my church and of my upbringing and relationship to religion. My mother was very artistic. So, for instance, when it was time for Lent, which for those of you who aren't Catholic, that time period before Easter is a very reverent, atoning, prayerful time where, as a Catholic, you think about what Jesus offered the community and how he suffered, and that in Catholicism brings human suffering into a kind of a sharing of the experience of Christ. And in Lent, that's particularly highlighted. And back to the point of my mother being artistic, she would create rooms in relationship to what's called the Station of the Cross, and where we went to Sunday school, that were all trying to recreate the environment that Jesus would have as he was experiencing his own Lent or his own time period before he was actually crucified. So, for instance, one of my favorite rooms was all full of plants, and it was the Garden of Gethsemane. My mother tried to recreate this garden. This garden is where Jesus prayed 3 times. It's featured in Matthew, at least in Matthew. And you would walk in through the plants to an area, in my memory, Mom, if you're watching, I'm not sure this is perfect, but this is my memory. You walked in through all of these plants, and then she had dry ice, so it was foggy, and there was a place for you to kneel and pray, just as if you were in the space where Jesus had this experience. Things like this were part of my upbringing around religion, and I really felt my way, like physically embodied in my religion, in a form of reverence and prayer that I enacted. And so I kind of internalized that as a really positive way to live in the world, very physically. And, you know, at the beginning of when the Catholic sexual abuse crisis came to light, or maybe through the middle of it, I would often meet people out to eat or traveling who would have really terrible memories and experiences with the church. And it was always disturbing. And I always just wanted to say there are so many resources in the church, but I didn't know how to express that at that time in relationship to the pain that I was seeing people undergo. Now, if you step outside of the church, in the Protestant church or in other religions, the issue of sex, sexuality, and gender comes to play very much in terms of how the church and how people within the church have harmed other people. The LGBTQIA community has really suffered as a result of judgments related to rules and the misinterpretation or the misusage of scripture in order to shame choices about who people love. And again, it's, to me, this is harmful. I have often thought about ways in which one could think about the church or think about religion that might help in processing the trauma or the suffering that people have endured in relationship to what the church has done. The first thought that came to mind, and it was actually inspired by a keynote lecture that I saw by Christina Traina, a professor at Fordham and a colleague, about Avery Dulles' models of church and then what she did with it, which I will get to in a minute. But these forms of church Avery Dulles created or thought about or encapsulated relate to thinking about the church as having different models. So basically models of church. And what he came up with was a list of 5. The church as an institution, the church as a sacrament, the church as a mystical communion, the church as a herald, and the church as a servant. He did not do what I'm about to articulate to you with his models, but I think his models help us think about the question of how those who have attachment to church or religion negotiate that attachment when there's experiences related to that religion of great harm. And I tell this to my students sometimes because I want them to think of the church as having different parts. So the church as an institution is that part of church that functions in some ways like a business. It has to have funds in order to bolster itself and grow and provide needs for the communities. There are leaders involved in that because leadership helps formulate this community and keep it cohesive. Now, there's good and bad forms of leadership, and that can be problematic. But the idea is that the institution is just one aspect of church or religion. And in my mind, it's often the part of church that hurts people. But if then we look at church as like this mystical communion where we're all engaging in some greater narrative that draws us into envisioning something in the world being greater than ourselves or divine or God, that we're taking part in this process it's so much larger than thinking about the church as institution, right? Then if you think about the church as a servant, the question is like, how is the church serving the community? What is the serving that the church or religion does for the community? So I could keep talking about these different compartments or these different models. I want to add too, so I'll go back to Christina Traina's work and then also something that Pope Francis said. But where I'm going with this is not to teach you necessarily about these different models of church. You can read about that. What I want to put forth is if we think about the church as functioning in these different roles, can we, if we've been harmed by the institution of the church, entered the idea of church as a servant or church as a herald calling out to people or church as a mystical communion? Can we enter these aspects of church and still participate while not accepting or by critiquing or by challenging church as an institution? What I'm supporting is for those of you who have an experience of feeling harmed by the church but still want to maintain or have a desire to maintain an intimate relationship with God or an intimate relationship with your faith, there's a room for critiquing the church's institution, but still participating in the religion as a sacrament or as a communion of people. So critiquing the rules, the dogma, the institution, but making a choice to participate in the rituals or the sacraments of the church. And by thinking about the church in these different compartments, it allows for some interpretation of what it means to say, I was really harmed by my church growing up, which is not what I'm saying, but what one could say. I was harmed by my church growing up, but I still want to participate in my religion because I care about it, because I've developed an intimate relationship with God. And, that brings me to say, when people are harmed by the church, how deeply wounding that can be, because our spiritual lives and our faith and our relationship with God is so intimate, right? It encapsulates and holds our deepest fears, our deepest desires, our hopes, our stability. And so when that's ruptured by people or by institutions, there's such a challenge in re-engaging with the intimacy that belief in divine or faith or a communion of people that share the same faith, what that can offer. Returning to this keynote, Christina Traina navigated these models of church and offered a new model in reference also to an additional model that Pope Francis created. So I'll go through both of those just briefly, just again for thinking about different ways in which we could choose to participate in our religions. Pope Francis's image speaks to my work pretty clearly, because he thinks about the church as a field hospital. And if you imagine what a field hospital does, it comes up in places where there's been tragedy, mass trauma, great wounding, and is there to provide spaces for care, recovery, healing of wounds, and is an open space, right? So anybody who feels wounded can come into this field hospital. Again, the metaphor is thinking about the church as a field hospital. So if the church doesn't function like a field hospital, if all of those who aren't welcome, all of those who are wounded or experience wounding aren't welcomed, then what is church? It underlies the importance of having the doors open to all. It underlines the importance for us to think about attending to human pain and suffering. And it's a metaphor that I like, because if all aren't welcomed into this space to heal, then what is the space really worth? In this lecture that I saw with Christina Traina, who again is a professor at Fordham, one of the things that she does remind us of is that there's been quite a bit of critique with Avery Adelis's models of church. But part of the asset of thinking about those models, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are multiple models. And so if we exclusively interpret the church as an institution and respond to it only that, it doesn't allow us access to these other models. Back to the model of the church as Jesus and the woman at the well. The woman at the well is a Samaritan woman, as I mentioned. She is both racially divergent and has a sexual history that would be not considered pro quo. So she's on the boundaries of being, so to speak, in terms of both her heritage and in terms of her expressions of love. Part of Traina's point is that the church should model the way that Jesus responded to her at the well. And you can read the story in the Gospel of John, because he is not only welcoming to the Samaritan woman, but also illustrates that he has something to learn from her. In this behavioral outpouring, so to speak, related to water in the well, or what's called living water, Jesus illustrates that there is an acceptance regardless of your race, regardless of who you love, regardless of if you follow the mores of the time. This behavior speaks to the importance of inclusivity of all in the church. It's much more robust, and I would encourage those of you who are interested to read this passage. And I hope what you take away from this video, if you have experienced harm from the church, is a new way of thinking about how to engage with your religion or your faith that's not exclusively related to that religion or faith as an institution.